Today on the Perception and Action podcast, do performers choose movement solutions that are economical? That is, those which not only achieve their performance goals, but are also efficient and have low energy expenditure. What information is available to guide a performer to a more economical movement solution? And how does it depend on attentional focus? How can this all be conceptualized in a constraints-based framework? So it's time for a call to action. Hello, and thanks for joining me. This is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. If you're a coach or an instructor, my goal is to help you bridge the gap between research and application, and to connect your experiential knowledge with skill acquisition and motor learning theory. I want to help take you from using practice design recipes to becoming a master chef who can manipulate the key ingredients to come up with your own innovative training methods. If you're a student or fellow academic working in the skill acquisition field, I hope to keep you up to date on the latest studies and help you get to know the people working in this area. Finally, if you're developing training technologies, I hope to help you incorporate good motor learning principles in your design, pull out key performance metrics from the data, and design effective studies to evaluate your product. To learn more, help support the podcast, and/or work directly with me, please check out perceptionaction.com. Now on to the show. On today's episode, I want to look at the frequently overlooked concept of movement economy. In the skill acquisition domain, we spend a lot of time considering how movement solutions emerge in order to satisfy the demands of our performance goals. We talk about how these solutions are shaped by the individual task and environmental constraints. However, something we don't consider nearly as often is the role of effort and economy in influencing how a performer solves a movement problem. I think this is an important omission for several reasons. First, if we're looking at highly skilled performers, we typically see that not only can they consistently achieve their goal and successfully adapt their movement solution to changing conditions, but they also tend to use movements that are more economical. I will get into specific definitions in a little bit, but simply put, their movement solutions require less effort. Is good movement economy just a byproduct of developing skill? For example, could it be a side effect of having a stable movement solution? Or is economy actually one of the primary criteria our perceptual motor system is trying to achieve when learning a new skill? Second, I think considering movement economy changes the way we look at practice design. For example, it can be related to a concept in motor learning called overlearning. Overlearning occurs when there's a plateau in measures of performance outcomes in training, but there's still skill development going on. So, with more and more practice, the athlete is not getting any faster or more accurate. A good example of this would be a situation in which the performer is continuing to use the same movement solution, but with more and more practice, they're able to do it with less energy expenditure. So it's becoming more economical. Finally, the role of movement economy emphasizes the importance of the link between skill training on the one hand and strength and conditioning on the other. Developing a system that is more efficient at using energy is going to expand the movement solutions available to a performer. Today, I first want to look at these concepts in a constraints-based framework using a paper by Sparrow and Newell. Then, I will move on to examine a couple studies by Gabby Wolf and colleagues, which show that indeed, well-known practice interventions, like changing the focus of attention or changing someone's expectations, also serve to influence movement economy. In their 1998 article published in Psychonomic Bulletin and Review, Sparrow and Newell begin by emphasizing a couple of points I made in today's intro. Quote, "From the repertoire of all possible movement sequences, humans and other organisms tend to adopt a coordination and control solution that is economical in terms of metabolic energy expenditures. But motor skill researchers have traditionally focused on the goal-directed nature of skill activities, with certainty and accuracy of goal attainment being the usual performance measures." And finally, quote, "Movement economy has not traditionally been an important issue in motor skills research, possibly because tasks demanding little metabolic energy expenditures have predominantly been studied." End quote. Think about most of the basic laboratory tasks used in motor learning studies: reaching, key pressing. Even when we use sport-specific tasks, we do things like golf putting and throwing a ball a short distance to a target. So essentially, even though it's clear that energy expenditure seems to be an important factor in skill, we effectively remove it in most of the tasks we study. Despite this, when we read definitions of what skill is, you'll often see reference to things like moving efficiently and moving smoothly. The authors next consider the two possible ways in which these ideas of efficiency and economy might be related to coordination and movement organization. First, they could be simply byproducts of a more fundamental organizing principle. So, energy expenditure is not regulated itself, but rather is minimized as a result of satisfying some other factor. For example, having movements that are more stable or perhaps less variable. The second possibility, and the one Sparrow and Newell clearly push for in their paper, is that minimizing energy expenditures is a primary mechanism for regulating coordination and control, which specifies a particular organization for movement over another. So in other words, rather than it being a side effect, metabolic energy regulation is a fundamental principle that underlies the learning and control of motor skills. To quote the authors, we hypothesize that processes of metabolic energy expenditure regulation explain both the short-term control of the movement and the learning of adaptive motor behavior with practice. So what exactly do we mean when we use the terms movement efficiency and economy? Traditionally, movement efficiency has been defined as the amount of work done divided by the energy used to achieve it. The amount of work has typically been expressed in terms of things like the distance traveled. But as the authors point out, this is somewhat limited because it doesn't really address the issue of multi-limb coordination. For energy used, we typically mean metabolic energy. That is the energy supplied by the metabolism of food. The authors make an important point here. Although our focus here is on how we regulate metabolic energy expenditure to meet the demands of a motor task, of course, energy is also always used for other functions simultaneously. For example, regulating our body temperature. From this, we can see the first example of how this can be understood in terms of a constraints-based approach. When we change the temperature or humidity of a practice location, we're changing an environmental constraint. One of the main ways this is going to have an effect is by altering the energy demands for thermoregulation of the body, and thus the amount of energy that can be used for the movement solution. What about movement economy? In their paper, the authors focus primarily on economy instead of efficiency, largely because it takes the need to measure the amount of work done out of the equation, which as I mentioned can be tricky. Movement economy can be defined as the amount of metabolic energy expended to achieve a task goal with fixed work or power demands. For example, kicking a penalty in soccer. This can be measured indirectly by using oxygen expenditure or using a biomechanical model. By fixing demands, we can look at how energy expenditure changes as a function of practice to achieve the same task goal, with a reduction reflecting an increase in movement economy. To quote the authors, if a task is devised that imposes apparently fixed mechanical power demands, changes in metabolic energy expenditure are usually interpreted as reflecting changes in efficiency. But as individuals adapt to a motor task with practice, the internal mechanical work associated with controlling and coordinating the limbs may also decrease over time. In such circumstances, the important performance criterion is metabolic energy expenditure, and economy may have improved. In their paper, Sparrow and Newell develop a constraints-based framework for understanding these ideas. So let's review a few fundamental concepts first. In this paper, constraints are defined as, quote, the boundaries, limitations, or design features that apply restrictions to movement. As I discussed back in episode 163, for me, this is missing a key part of the definition, especially when we talk about the CLA. That is, that constraints are not only restrictive, but they are also frequently informative. Also critical in this framework is Newell's distinction between coordination and control. Coordination can be defined as the relationship between the movements of different limb segments during the execution of a skill. Control refers to the magnitude of limb segment movement expressed in terms of kinematics and kinetics. So, for example, the amplitude, velocity, and acceleration of the limbs. So the process of control involves establishing parameters for the coordination function. To quote the authors, some adaptations to the demands of motor tasks arise from the tuning, scaling, or parameterizing of an existing coordination mode, a change in control, whereas others constitute a fundamental reorganization of the movement, what we would call a change in coordination. Thus, coordination and control are embedded concepts in the execution of a skill, and the overall goal of the task could be achieved by changing coordination, control, or both. Skill is an emergent property and can be defined operationally in terms of the ability to economically coordinate and control the movement to achieve the task goal. End quote. Now let's consider how these concepts relate specifically to the ideas of movement economy. Organism or individual constraints, such as the weight of our limbs, the rate at which our muscles can generate force, etc., impose physical limitations on our body's ability to move in a manner that will solve our task demands. So obviously they influence movement economy. In general, individual constraints are considered to be fixed over the relatively short term in which we acquire a skill. However, as I mentioned at the start of today's episode, they can, of course, over a longer term be altered via appropriate strength and conditioning. The authors describe the role of individual constraints in motor learning really nicely. Quote, "The critical concept underlying an understanding of organism constraints is adaptation. In adapting motor patterns to meet task demands, constraints of the organism are accommodated rather than overcome, because all living organisms have fundamental constraints that limit adaptation to the environment in the performance of various perceptual motor tasks." End quote. In other words, we need to find a solution that works for our own individual capabilities rather than trying to force a square peg into a round hole. As I mentioned a few moments ago, environmental constraints like temperature can influence movement economy, but we rarely manipulate them in practice or research. Another important environmental constraint is gravity. This was something that Bernstein thought a lot about. Specifically, he pointed out that although the Earth's gravitational force is constant, the gravitational forces that must be overcome when we move change continuously as a function of the orientation of our limbs. Finally, in terms of task constraints, 3 different types are discussed. First, rule constraints, in which the performer is constrained in achieving a task goal by rules that constrain the nature of the movement output. In discussing this, the authors make a key point that we need to keep reminding ourselves of. Quote, "Successful performance in such tasks requires attainment of a defined goal in a manner that is consistent with observing the rules. In such tasks, the biomechanical characteristics of the movement that is necessary to attain the goal are relatively unimportant, and therefore constraints on the coordination and control of limb movements are relatively few. Most ball games fall into this classification, in that, although there are elaborate rules governing the overall conduct of the game, participants are relatively unconstrained in the manner in which they move their limbs to achieve the task goal." End quote. In other words, in most sports, there are really very few constraints imposed on how we can move to achieve our goal. The second type of task constraint mentioned in this article are those imposed by tools or implements we use to perform an action. For example, a bicycle constrains the legs to move in a circular motion. Finally, there are biomechanical task constraints. These are really what defines the task itself. For example, the reason that we call walking and running 2 different things is because walking has a constraint, that one foot must be in contact with the ground at all times, that running doesn't. In some sports, we self-impose these type of constraints. You have to keep your head down when you swing a golf club. While in others, like gymnastics, the success of the outcome is actually achieved based on the constrained pattern of movement itself. Before leaving this section and getting back to movement economy, I wanted to address a question I get asked every once in a while. What is the difference between a task and an environmental constraint? Here is the perhaps overly simple logic I use. If it affects only one sport or skill, it's a task constraint. If it would affect more than one sport or skill, it's an environmental constraint. For example, if I go to my local park and change the size of the soccer nets, take a few players off the soccer field, or deflate the soccer ball, it's going to have absolutely no effect on people there playing tennis or baseball. Therefore, it's a task constraint. If instead I soak the whole park with water or take down a wall blocking the wind, it's going to have effect on all these sports. Therefore, it's an environmental constraint. Okay, so how can we understand movement economy in this framework? In their paper, Sparrow and Newell include an adapted version of the classic constraints triangle figure that illustrates the basic ideas. We still have the 3 organism, task, and environmental corners of the triangle, but with some subtle additions. Energy input going into the organism and metabolic energy outputs in 2 forms. 1, to meet the demands of the environment like gravity and thermal regulation, and 2, to meet the demands of the coordination solution used to achieve the task goals. To quote the authors, an organism's movements are characterized as emerging from the interaction of environment and task constraints with constraints of the organism. It is proposed furthermore that the process of adaptation is guided by minimum metabolic energy criteria, so that task and environmental constraints are accommodated with minimal metabolic costs. End quote. I think another way to think of this is that minimizing energy expenditure is a requirement of the movement solution that emerges, just as achieving the task goal is a requirement. Another often overlooked requirement is injury prevention. As we discussed in the Journal Club back in episode 305, in order to protect itself, your body is going to impose some limitations on the potential movement solutions that can be used to solve a task goal. What research evidence is there to support these ideas? First, it has been shown in several studies that when asked to perform a task in the short term, individuals will adopt a movement pattern that minimizes energy expenditure, an effect called self-optimization. This has been shown in studies using tasks like cycling, walking, and running. For example, it has been shown that we seem to optimize stride length for different running speeds to reach minimum points on our oxygen consumption curve. A key point is that this self-optimization occurs even when performers aren't given any augmented information, for example, shown a heart rate monitor. We will get to the information that they actually might use in a few minutes. From this research, two possibilities for why self-optimization occurs have been proposed. Quote, the two most likely explanations for these findings were either that humans are sensitive to metabolic costs and adopt a preferred gait on the basis of such sensory information, or that consistent with dynamical systems theory, preferred behaviors emerge from stability considerations, and an economical movement pattern is the consequence of stable dynamics. End quote. Interestingly, movement economy also seems to be strongly related to gait transitions. In both humans, walking to run, and horses, walk to trot to gallop, the transition between these different patterns of coordination closely follow oxygen consumption curves. For example, a horse will switch from walking to trotting when the speed is such that oxygen consumption required for a trot begins to become less than required for a walk. This results in the metabolic cost of coordinating limb movements staying constant per unit distance traveled, suggesting it could be an invariant in the organization of movement. This provides evidence that coordination is being organized directly on the basis of movement economy rather than being a side effect produced by stability considerations. Another well-studied effect that supports Sparrow and Newell's proposed model is entrainment. Entrainment occurs when there's a synchronization between the temporal phasing of a physiological process and the events within a movement pattern. The most common example is the relationship between breathing and leg movements while walking or running. There's typically a fixed ratio between the number of steps and the number of breaths. Humans typically adopt a ratio somewhere between 1:1 and 1:4. This effect can also be seen in cycling and rowing. The ability to flexibly adapt this ratio may again be a mechanism for achieving movement economy. Finally, it's also been shown that the coupling between stride length and breathing is more precise in experienced runners as compared to less experienced, suggesting that it might be an ability that is acquired through practice. Speaking of which, how does movement economy relate to motor learning and skill acquisition? As I mentioned at the start of today's episode, in most theories, the definition of a skill has elements of economy in it, using terms like smooth, easy, or economical. In the Sparrow and Newell framework, it is proposed that when training, performance will go up while energy expenditure will go down, thus achieving both task success and movement economy. Examples of this can be seen in several different types of research. Studies of simple reaching movements, for example by David Rosenbaum and colleagues, have shown that with practice, hand movements minimize required force, impulse, and jerk. Associated subjective ratings reveal that performers feel these as being less effortful and more comfortable. This can also be seen with studies that use measures of perceived exertion, for example, the well-known Borg scale. Over days of practice, perceived exertion typically decreases, while the work achieved either increases or stays the same, resulting again in an increase in movement economy. There have also been a handful of studies that have looked at acquiring sports skills in this context. In 1976, Asami and colleagues examined the relationship between skill level, energy expenditure, and accuracy in soccer ball kicking. Energy expenditure for kicks of different velocities was calculated based on the movement kinematics. Movement efficiency was calculated by dividing the kinetic energy delivered to the ball by the energy expenditure. One highly skilled player was compared to a lesser skilled one. What was found? The energy expenditure required to kick the ball at a given velocity was significantly lower for the more skilled player. For example, at a velocity of 20 meters per second, it was half. There was also a large difference in the maximal velocity that could be achieved, about 25 meters per second for the skilled player and only 20 meters per second for the lesser skilled. Interestingly, when shot accuracy was assessed, it was found that maximal accuracy occurred for both players when the ball was kicked at a velocity for which movement efficiency was maximized. This was at about 80% of the maximal velocity for both players. In 1981, Brancazio examined movement economy in basketball shooting. He first estimated the optimal ball release angle that required the smallest amount of force to get the ball to the basket while still having a relatively high margin for error in the shot. It was found that the actual shots performed by skilled players were close to this predicted trajectory. Finally, in 1994, Durand and colleagues examined changes in energy expenditure using oxygen consumption, performance, and movement economy as a function of practice on a ski simulator task. Interestingly, it was found that with more hours of practice, the energy expenditure increased. This makes total sense if we relate it back to the studies of freezing degrees of freedom I talked about back in episode 185. In their classic ski simulator study, Verreiken and colleagues found that performers initially freeze degrees of freedom by making movements with smaller ranges of motion. Thus, it would be expected that they would use less energy. So along with helping solve the degrees of freedom problem, freezing might be a solution that also serves to satisfy the requirement of minimizing energy expenditure for a new learner. But as they begin to free degrees of freedom and make larger amplitude, higher frequency movements, more energy would be required. However, if you actually look at the amount of work achieved by the freed movements in terms of the estimated speed the skier would travel at, movement economy, work done divided by energy used, actually increases with practice. These studies all seem to provide some evidence for there being a relationship between motor learning, economy, and related changes in the coordination and control of movement. To quote the authors, the major principle that emerges from this literature is that with practice, organisms learn to adapt movements in order to achieve the task goal with the greatest movement economy. The final issue Sparrow and Newell discuss is what information might be available to a performer to allow for regulation of movement economy. In classic work on human behavior, information coming to our central nervous system is classified into three different types. Proprioceptors that monitor the state of our muscles, tendons, and joints. Exterioreceptors giving information about the external environment, such as that attained from vision. And interoreceptors that signal the condition of the internal state of the body with respect to temperature, blood pressure, cardiovascular function, etc. Obviously, the first two of these have been well studied in motor control and motor learning, but interoception has been typically assumed to have little relevance to the control of action. In their paper, Sparrow and Newell have a very different view. Quote, "In contrast, we view motor behavior as fundamentally the process by which organisms convert chemical energy through the metabolism of foodstuffs to mechanical energy in order to interact adaptively with their environment. Thus, the role of sensory information in signaling the economy of motor responses is considered central to the study of motor behavior. The paper's fundamental contribution to the discussion of the sensory control of movement is the proposal that sensory information from the internal organs, interoceptive information, should be considered a major component of the sensory input by which movements are coordinated and controlled." End quote. There is some evidence to support this idea. For example, studies using augmented biofeedback show that we can learn to couple exteroceptive and interoceptive information. For example, while exercising on a treadmill or stationary bicycle, participants given augmented cardiovascular feedback can better control pedaling to reduce heart rate and blood pressure as compared to no feedback controls. To sum up this paper, there seems to be good evidence consistent to support the idea that, quote, "patterns of movement coordination and control can be viewed as emerging from an interaction of constraints, with metabolic energy expenditure being the currency of the interaction. The expedient to move economically can be usefully viewed as guiding the search for the optimal coordination and control solutions to the problem of overcoming task and environmental constraints." End quote. To finish off today's episode, I want to look at a couple studies by Gabby Wolf and colleagues that have examined the relationship between movement economy and practice design, using well-studied effects in the motor learning literature. The first is one by Zachary and colleagues published in 2005. In this paper, the authors examine how focus of attention instructions influence movement economy. To achieve this end, a basketball free throw task was used during which energy expenditure could be assessed by measuring EMG activity from different muscles of the body. 14 university students with at least 1 year basketball playing experience participated in a within-subjects design, with order counterbalanced. Interestingly, participants were prescribed a solution at the start of the study. For example, they were told how to square their shoulders to the basket, position their feet, hold the ball, etc. They then performed 2 sets of 10 shots under different focus of attention instruction conditions. For the internal focus condition, participants were instructed to concentrate on the snapping motion of the wrist during the follow-through of the free throw. For the external focus condition, they were instructed to concentrate on the center of the rear of the hoop. Shot accuracy was scored on a 0 to 5 scale, with 0 being an air ball, 5 being a swish, and points in between for hitting the rim, etc. EMG was recorded from the wrist, the body part they were told to focus on in the internal condition, and other body parts including the biceps, triceps, and shoulder. What was found? First, consistent with previous work, shooting accuracy was significantly higher in the external focus condition, by about half a point on average. For EMG, it was found that activity was significantly lower in the external focus condition for the biceps and triceps, while there was no significant difference for either the wrist or the shoulder. The authors hypothesized that the lack of significant effect for the wrist might have been due to a ceiling effect, since it's always highly active during shooting. So clearly this study shows higher movement economy with an external focus of attention. Players are achieving a higher level of performance with less effort. Given the pattern of EMG activity, it suggests that this is rather a diffuse effect and not specific to the body part being focused on. The authors also speculate that the greater EMG activity in the internal focus condition might reflect more noise in the motor system that serves to impair fine movement control. The other study I wanted to mention was one published by Swati and colleagues in 2012. In this study, the authors wanted to examine the effect of enhanced expectancies, which, as I discussed in the interview with Gabby in episode 80, can affect motor performance, whether they also influence movement economy. To achieve this end, 20 participants from local running clubs were split into 2 groups of 10. After an initial assessment session, runners in both groups were asked to run for 10 minutes at 75% of their VO2 max. Participants assigned to the enhanced expectancy group were given a feedback statement regarding their efficiency while running. Quote, "You're doing great. Your oxygen consumption is in the top 10th percentile for your age and gender," end quote. And a similar statement was provided every 2 minutes. No feedback statements were given to the control group. What was found? While there was no difference in heart rate or ratings of perceived exertion, oxygen consumption significantly decreased for the expectancy group while remaining constant for the control group. The authors proposed that this was due to the enhanced expectancy for performance success in the former group. However, and tying this back to the first paper I talked about today, I think it's equally plausible that the feedback statement served as augmented feedback about movement economy, which served to alter the coordination solution that emerged. But I think this is definitely an interesting line of work. We need more studies looking at how movement economy, energy expenditure, and different practice design manipulations interact. In particular, it would be interesting to see how movement economy changes and differs with self-organization-based approaches to skill acquisition. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep 'em coupled.